When polar bears evolved to live on the sea ice, they evolved to eat a seal, primarily ice-associated seal diet. Well, that diet's purely carnivorous, and it's really high in fats, higher than any other species, higher than any other ursid. And there's recent genomic studies coming out that show that physiologically, bears have probably changed genetically and physiologically specific to that very high fat diet. The polar bear is a species of bear that has evolved to live on the sea ice that floats over the top of the Arctic Ocean. And because that's where they've lived, they've adapted in a variety of ways to that environment. For example, people often ask me why polar bears have so much shorter claws than grizzly bears, and I describe that it's sort of like ice crampons. They're not digging so much with those claws, but they're using it to be able to be stable on the sea ice. They've obviously evolved to have white fur, so they can't be seen by their prey as well. They blend in with their Arctic environment, making it really difficult for us to find them out on the sea ice. They are good swimmers.
I think it's valuable to take a step back in time and look at the situation with polar bear populations and climate change at the time that polar bears were listed in 2008 under the Endangered Species Act, and then compare it to now. And so if you look back in 2008, there are 19 subpopulations of polar bears. At that time, there were 5 subpopulations that were believed to be in decline. 2 were increasing, 5 were stable, and there were 7 subpopulations that were deemed data deficient, meaning we really don't know what's going on in those subpopulations. If we fast forward to 2012, we have now 8 subpopulations that are known to be in decline. 2 are still increasing, and those subpopulations are in the region called the Canadian Archipelago, which is projected to be long-term refugia for polar bears. In Alaska, we have 2 subpopulations. There's the Southern Beaufort Sea subpopulation that we share with Canada, and there's the Chukchi Sea subpopulation that we share with Russia.
We compared the current condition of the animals in the Chukchi Sea with the Southern Beaufort Sea, and we found that the Southern Beaufort Sea bears are smaller, they're in poorer condition, and they have lower rates of cub survival. So that was a very, very interesting finding and has led to questions that is the focus of most of my current work, is just to understand, well, why is that? Why do you have 2 populations adjacent to each other that have both seen sea ice loss, but you don't see the same response? And there's some really important points from this. We haven't seen a response in the Chukchi Sea in terms of their declines in their body condition reproduction to date, but there is substantial continued sea ice loss there. So we've been really, really careful to say that, well, this is a really interesting finding that they have not yet had any changes in condition reproduction. We don't expect that there can be endless sea ice loss without some impact eventually. They have to have the ice to access ice seals, which is their primary prey.
The Southern Beaufort Sea subpopulation has been studied by USGS for almost 30 years now. In the Chukchi Sea, we have less of an understanding because research has really only been done on the population side of things in the Chukchi, most recently since 2008.
And there are some really clear differences between those 2 areas. The Chukchi Sea has the Bering Strait, which brings warm, very productive waters. It's also very shallow. Almost the entirety of the polar bear's range in the Chukchi Sea is over very shallow water. In the Southern Beaufort Sea, there's a very narrow area of continental shelf that's thought to be the most productive habitats. So in the Southern Beaufort Sea in the summertime, as the sea ice has retreated off the continental shelf, the bears are going to end up in ice that's over very deep water where we suspect there's fewer seals. In the Chukchi Sea, when the ice retreats, it still remains over some shallow waters where there's probably some seals still available to them. So those systems are very different. It's not just about whether they've lost the ice, but are there still seals available in the habitats they're using? And so we're looking into that further, but there's definitely some very clear differences in those 2 ecosystems that may be the reason that we're already seeing effects of sea ice loss in the Southern Beaufort Sea and haven't seen them quite yet in the Chukchi Sea.
The last 10 or 15 years, we've seen sea ice retract further and further away each summer from that continental shelf. And what that's doing is rendering that shelf habitat functionally absent because there's no sea ice to hunt seals over. That's changing the dynamic between polar bears and ring seals. Polar bears have less time to hunt ring seals each summer.
Unlike other bear species, only pregnant polar bears den purely for the purposes of producing cubs. When they're in the den, they're not eating anything. They're fasting that entire time. So they have a very different annual nutritional cycle during those years where they have to den and produce cubs. It means they have to put on enough body fat, have enough energy stores to enter a den, meet their own caloric needs, and also enough nutrients to produce a cub and also lactate for that cub after it's born in approximately January in the den.
Ultimately, that's being manifested in the long-term data that we have that indicates a trend of decreased body mass through time. Structurally, bears in the southern Beaufort are getting a little bit smaller, so their stature is getting smaller through time. And those are probably all effects of some degree of chronic nutritional stress.
The concept of nutrition in my work is relatively broad, so not just what they eat, but the impacts of what they eat. So for example, when we look at the body mass of females, a female that has come out of the den, and we look at that same female during a year that she has not denned, it can be up to 100-pound difference in her body mass. So she loses substantial body mass and body fat reserves when she has cubs. So the only way she's able to produce cubs is to have put on substantial body fat prior to entering the den. Because their diet is actually pretty narrow. They don't eat a lot of different things. It's really about how much they eat. And how much they eat relates directly to their reproduction and their survival. And how is that related to sea ice, since they need the sea ice to access their food?
The future for polar bears is still unwritten. There is a lot of concern in the polar bear community, and I think the general conservation community, about how unmitigated climate change is going to affect not just polar bears, but other wildlife species. And the Arctic is kind of that sentinel system.
The information we're gathering on the ecology of the population and how healthy the bears are is informative to making decisions about harvest levels. There's also oil and gas activity in both the Chukchi Sea and the Southern Beaufort Sea, so we get information on where the bears are, when and where they might interact with oil and gas activities or other human activities. Polar bear management is conducted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they are authorized to manage polar bears under those authorities, the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Much of the work that we do feeds into what they need to do to meet the specifications and those authorities for protecting polar bears.